guys, it's Kenya the Poet here. I just wanted to thank you so much for joining my group. To all the new members, welcome. The people who have joined and have been a member of the group and are just participating, supporting my work, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And whether you joined because you're an avid lover of poetry or you just joined because you wanted to support me, I really do immensely thank you. So with that, I'm going to take 5 questions and let you get to know me a little bit better. Okay, here we go. Question 1. So I started writing poetry when I was 6 years old. My mother is also a writer, and she has a degree in English and biology. And I've just always been encouraged to be creative. So at 6 years old, I actually couldn't read or write. How about that? And so I would be with my mom and I would say, "Mom, write this down, write this down." And she would grab a pen and paper and she would write it down, and I would just tell her all these poems and recite all these poems that I'd written. And she was always encouraging and always supporting, and so that's a little bit about how I get started. My favorite poet, that is a good one. It's really hard to say because there's so many. But I'm going to say a couple of my favorite writers and then a couple of my favorite poets. I love James Baldwin. I just have so much respect for his perspective and his tenacity. And he wrote about social justice issues in a time when it was dangerous. And it still is dangerous, right? You can have cancel culture, you can be physically threatened. And a lot of the oppressive tactics are more soft, right? They're more covert. You're not necessarily going to be, lynched, and that could happen too. But you might not get a job opportunity if someone finds out that your beliefs are for the Black Lives Matter movement, or you're speaking about racism and inequality. And so, you can be written pretty hard when you speak up and speak out about the history of racism in America and this country. And so I really like James Baldwin because I feel like he gives it to you straight, no chaser. He doesn't really try to be PC or politically correct that we see on a lot of these TV shows or talk shows or even in print, people who are really just afraid to say what they really think. There's a fine line between saying something that's really irresponsible or hurtful or even racist, and then just telling the truth. Like, this is American history. You did own African Americans. You did lynch African Americans. You did separate, mothers from their children. You did rape African American women. For, hundreds of years, you've created a system to police, to over-police and mass incarcerate and abuse and continue to keep in economic poverty African American people, not people of color. That's one of the things I don't like. I don't like that we've sort of muted things down and now it has to be people of color, or being black is just like being gay and it's all kind of the same. It's not. There's no other oppression like being African American. It's okay to say African American or black without having to include people of color or some other oppressed group. Not that those other groups don't matter or their issues aren't important, but I feel that we're living in a society, especially now, where we just can't say African American, or we can't talk about the systems that have existed to oppress just specifically African Americans. And so James Baldwin, for me, just spoke unapologetically about the circumstances of African Americans in America and how they've created some of those conditions that we as African American people have been forced to live under. As far as poetry, I like Maya Angelou. Langston Hughes I like him a lot. I like Paul Laurence Dunbar. So I love Nikki Giovanni. So those are some of my favorite poets. If I could write a poem about anything, what would it be? It's so interesting. I was at Columbia College, that's a whole nother story, pursuing an acting degree, that's a whole nother story. But at any event, I had a teacher, and I can remember his face, I don't recall his name. He was a theater person, but I don't think it was a theater class, I feel like it was an academic class. Anyway, he introduced me to Ron Karenga, and what he said was, Ron Karenga had a quote, all art is political. And I really didn't like that quote at the time. I remember, sort of tussling with it and fighting against it. And later, I realized it's kind of true. And when I look at my poetry, remember, I've been writing poems since I was 6 years old. My poems have always been political. When I was younger, they were more about nature. about society, about humanity. More recently, within the last several years, they've been about social inequality and social justice. And James Baldwin, right, one of my favorite writers, who says, you know, you write about what you know, but also what you see. And so a lot of my poems are writing about the voice of the people, not necessarily what I myself feel. Sometimes they're just about articles that I've read and just sort of a synopsis of what that moment is and what those people are feeling. The press group that I'm speaking of, typically African American, often African American women. Sometimes they're my own thoughts, my own experiences. But all art is political. I hate to say it, it is. And but if I could just write a poem about anything, I would love to write about something else. But as an African American woman, I feel like I've been unnecessarily unduly burdened with the task of speaking against inequality, because it exists. I experience it every day, all day, and twice on Sunday. So it's not like I choose this fight. But I'm the type of person that I loathe any type of injustice. I've always spoken up and spoken out, and it has cost me, trust me. But I think it's important. So I'd love to write a poem about love or romance, which some of my earlier work reflects. So maybe I would try that, yeah. But right now, my poems, I'm not going to lie, they're about social justice. If I could go anywhere in the world, where would it be? Okay, so if we were not experiencing COVID, I probably would want to travel internationally. I don't know where. I would love to go to Korea. I want to learn a little bit more Korean. I studied at Yale University in their summer drama art program. I was studying acting back then, and I got a partial scholarship to go study at Yale. And everybody was Korean. Like, I mean, it was like two black folk walking around. And so all my friends were either like Korean or Vietnamese or Japanese, but a lot of them were Korean. So there was this guy that I used to play pool with. His name was Benny. And he couldn't speak a word of English, and I at the time didn't speak a word of Korean. So I had a friend named Nanjun, and he was trying to teach me Korean, which he was successful in teaching me some Korean, but he wouldn't teach me how to read or write it. So I know a few words in Korean, just a little, and I'd probably travel to Korea if there weren't this COVID thing and you could just kind of up and go wherever you want to go. One of the things that I like about my poems? Wow, that's a great question. I'm not going to go on an ego trip like Nikki Giovanni, right? One of the things that I like about my poems is its authenticity. That's what I like. There's another young lady, and I can't think of her name right now. She's on Facebook. Went ahead, sorry, my video cut off. And I went ahead and joined her group. And when I read her poems are all about her experiences. She's a white woman, and she is, I think she was in the foster care system, and just every poem is about, you know, abuse as a child, essentially. But it's so raw, and it's so authentic. So what I like about my own poetry, since you asked, is the authenticity of it. It's not all warm and fuzzy, the poems that I'm doing now, which are really socially justice-minded. And I love the fact that I can speak with that authenticity without trying to water it down or worry about who's not going to give it a like or who's going to ignore it and pretend they didn't see it or who's going to be pissed. I just write with the intent of imparting this information to the world, and then you can like it, you can hate it, that's totally fine. I always welcome feedback and criticism as long as it's constructive. But that's what I like about myself as a poet, that I'm not really afraid to shine a light in those dark spaces and speak about things that people are scared they'll lose their job over if they say. And I also love the fact that I speak about black women, because somehow we have to say black people or people of color. And speaking about African American women as necessary and valuable human beings in society is not popular, and I'm willing to go there. So that's one of the things I like about my poetry.